It started with a ladder. I pulled into the driveway late one night after a long, grueling shift at the shop. The truck's engine coughed into life, and as I eased to a stop, the only sound was the distant hum of night and the clatter of my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just the relief of coming home for a beer. But then I saw it, a rickety, rusted ladder propped against the garage wall beneath the high window Lila had always sworn she'd never use. Something in me shifted. An inexplicable pull urged me to approach. Without fully understanding why, I found myself stepping closer to that ladder, the metal creaking under the weight of years of neglect. I hesitated only a moment before I began to climb. Each step was tentative, my boots slipping on the worn rungs more than once. The silence around me was complete except for the whisper of my breath and the occasional groan of the old metal. I reached the level of the window where the air smelled faintly of oil and dust, a smell I had come to associate with home. There, in the dim glow of a flickering fluorescent bulb, I saw her. Lila was on the workbench, her form partially illuminated by the harsh light. Her skirt was hiked up, revealing more than just skin, and one of her legs was draped around Darren's shoulder. Darren, Lila's stepbrother and the man who had recently invaded our space, sat with a casual familiarity on our old couch, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. His grip on her thigh was possessive, yet disturbingly casual, as though their intimacy was nothing more than a daily routine. Not far from them stood Jake, my 22-year-old son. His shirt was unbuttoned and he was methodically pouring motor oil over Lila's chest, watching the thick, dark liquid drip slowly down her skin. His face held a smug, almost triumphant smile, as if he'd orchestrated this entire spectacle for his own amusement. I froze on the ladder, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could shatter the fragile silence of that moment. I didn't shout or make a scene, I couldn't. I clung to that ladder as if it were the only solid thing in a world suddenly turned upside down. Every fiber of my being screamed to act, yet I remained still, a silent witness to the betrayal unfolding in the dim light. Then, as if sensing my presence, Darren glanced up. His eyes met mine for an instant, and in that brief second, time seemed to stop. Lila's eyes widened in shock, and she gasped, her body twisting as she tried to disentangle herself from the intimate hold. Jake, however, merely chuckled, a low, mean sound that reverberated in the cramped space, as if I were nothing more than a bad joke. I slid down the ladder as carefully as I could. Each rung was a small stab of pain, both physical and emotional, as I descended back into a reality that suddenly felt alien. I hit the gravel hard, knees stinging and breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The keys in my pocket still felt warm, a small, painful reminder of the life I once knew. Without a backward glance, I got into the truck and started the engine, its roar a desperate attempt to drown out the silence of my shattered home. Driving away, the world blurred into a montage of dark roads and trembling headlights. The truck sped down the empty streets, my mind reeling with images that I couldn't erase. I eventually pulled over by the river, a dark, placid mirror reflecting the moon's cold light. There, parked on the bank, I sat alone with my thoughts and the relentless ticking of the clock on my dash. It read 10:13. At that moment, time itself felt as if it had conspired to freeze, marking the precise minute when everything unraveled. For months before, nothing had hinted at the impending collapse of our family. Lila and I had been partners, our love a slow burn rather than an explosive passion. She would hum softly as she cooked, and I would spend evenings tinkering with her car. Life had been predictable, if not perfect, a comfortable routine that I had never imagined could be disrupted so completely. Then Darren had arrived. With a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a bottle of Jack Daniels dangling from his grasp, he had casually claimed he needed a place to stay after splitting with his girlfriend. Lila had insisted, he's family, Mark, and so, against my better judgment, I agreed. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement soon stretched into an unwelcome permanence. Darren's presence became a fixture in our home, a constant reminder of the boundaries that had been steadily eroding. And then Jake, my son, had drifted into the chaos as well. Initially, his arrival was met with the tender indulgence reserved for a child returning home for the break. Lila's affectionate care, however, soon revealed layers of complicity that I had been too blind or too weary to notice. Small moments had added up, lingering touches, shared looks that spoke volumes, and a silent understanding that I was slowly being edged out of my own life. That night, as I sat by the river, every image replayed in my mind with a haunting clarity. The ladder, the old fluorescent light, Lila's unexpected laughter, and Jake's cold, deliberate actions, each moment was etched into my memory, a stark reminder of betrayal. I couldn't understand how the people I loved could betray me in such a calculated, unfeeling manner. For a long while, I sat in the darkness, the gentle murmur of the river lulling me into a state of numb acceptance. I realized that something fundamental had shifted, that the home I had built was no longer mine. In that quiet, painful solitude, I resolved to leave, to try to salvage whatever fragments of dignity remained within me. The image of the ladder, once an insignificant fixture, now symbolized the beginning of the end. It was as if each step I had climbed that night led me deeper into a reality where love had turned into betrayal, where every familiar face had become a stranger. That ladder would forever remind me of the night my world fractured, and the bitter taste of oil and betrayal would linger long after the memory of its rusted rungs had faded. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew I had to move on. I couldn't go back to a home filled with ghosts of trust and shattered illusions. The decision was made, almost silently, in that moment by the river. I would leave behind the remnants of a life that was no longer mine and venture into a future that, though uncertain, promised the possibility of rediscovery and renewal. I started the truck once more, its engine a low, steady rumble against the quiet morning. With each mile I drove away from the place that had once been my sanctuary, I felt a heavy weight lifting from my shoulders, a painful yet necessary step toward reclaiming my identity. The road ahead was dark and winding, but even in the midst of despair, I clung to the faint hope that somewhere beyond the horizon I might find a way to rebuild a life from the fragments left behind. The memory of that night, with its raw emotions and undeniable truths, would forever remain etched in my mind. Yet, in that painful clarity, there was also a seed of possibility, a chance to start anew, even if it meant leaving behind everything familiar. In the days that followed that fateful night, I couldn't shake the images of the betrayal. The memory of that cold, moonlit river where I sat alone with my thoughts haunted every moment. At first, I tried to bury the pain in routine. I drove to work, spent long hours in the shop, and let the monotonous clang of tools mask the chaotic noise in my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gleam of the fluorescent light, the sight of Lila's laughter mingled with that sinister chuckle from Jake, and the mocking glare in Darren's eyes. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up with the bitter taste of regret and isolation clinging to my tongue. The emptiness of our home, once filled with the gentle hum of shared life, now felt cavernous and foreign. I'd find the coffee pot cold on the counter, and the silence that greeted me at the breakfast table was as loud as a scream. Lila would slip away without a word, leaving me to face a day where every familiar object felt like a relic of a past I no longer belonged to. I started to notice the small details that had changed long before the night of the ladder. At first, it was the way Lila would avoid our eyes in the mornings, her voice quieter, her responses curt. Then there was Darren, whose casual presence in every corner of the house had grown more brazen. I'd catch him in the kitchen, making coffee with a relaxed air as if he owned every moment. And Jake, my once admired son, began to seem like a stranger. His once innocent smirk now carried an edge, a hint that he understood far more than he'd let on. I found myself wandering through the house as if searching for remnants of what had been. In the living room, I traced my fingertips along the back of a worn sofa, trying to recall the laughter and warmth that used to fill the space. In the kitchen, I'd linger over a photograph on the wall, a snapshot of a happier time, feeling the sting of betrayal with every passing second. Every room was saturated with memories, yet the present was a stark reminder that those memories belonged to someone else now. At work, the steady clink of metal and hum of engines provided a welcome distraction. I threw myself into my tasks, changing oil, fixing brakes, and tuning up engines. Each task was a small rebellion against the chaos of home, a way to reassert control over something, anything, in a life that felt increasingly out of control. My hands, thick with grease, became the only parts of me that felt grounded. They were no longer just the instruments of my labor, they were also a lifeline, a tangible connection to the man I used to be. But even the sanctuary of my workshop could not completely shield me from the relentless weight of loss. Occasionally, as I worked on a car or adjusted a wrench, I'd catch a glimpse of a memory, Lila's gentle smile as she handed me a cup of coffee, the sound of her soft laugh echoing in the background. In those moments, the grief would surge up like a tidal wave, threatening to drown me in its force. I'd pause, tool in hand, staring off into nothingness, trying desperately to recall when things had begun to crumble. It wasn't one moment, I realized, it was a slow, insidious erosion where every act of negligence, every silent acceptance contributed to the disintegration of our shared life. Late one afternoon, I found myself driving along a stretch of deserted highway, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of bruise and fire. The open road offered a temporary reprieve from the suffocating confines of my memories. With no destination in mind, I let the miles pass under the steady hum of my truck's engine, each mile a tentative step away from the ruins of home. The highway, endless and indifferent, reminded me that I was but a small, broken part of a much larger world, one where time continued unabated regardless of my personal despair. Yet, even as the landscape blurred past the window, I felt a tug at the back of my mind, a reminder that the past was never truly behind me. I recalled the final moments in our home, the quiet departure of Lila with her bag in hand, the muted resignation in her eyes as she left, the door clicking shut behind her. That image played over and over in my mind, a loop of finality that refused to fade. I questioned everything. Was it a choice? Had she been waiting for this moment all along? And what of Darren and Jake? Were they complicit, or were they simply victims of a twisted fate? As dusk turned to night, I reluctantly steered my truck back toward the city. The familiar glow of streetlights and the hum of distant traffic signaled a return to the world I'd temporarily escaped, a world where every face on the street might be a reminder of what I'd lost. I parked in a lonely lot and sat for a long time, staring at the truck's worn dashboard. The radio played a soft tune that I couldn't quite place, a song of loss and quiet determination that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own heartbeat. In those silent moments, the realization struck me: I couldn't keep running forever. The road had offered solace, a brief respite from the relentless pain, but eventually I would have to confront the wreckage of my life head-on. The memory of that night, the ladder, the fluorescent light, and the cold, callous laughter was a scar that wouldn't easily fade. Yet it also became a grim map pointing the way forward through the darkness. Back at the truck, I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages, trying to find a trace of the man I once was. There were no reassuring words, only echoes of promises and commitments that had been broken long ago. The realization was as bitter as it was clear. I had to rebuild, not for anyone else, but for myself. I made a silent vow that night, in the quiet solitude of a nearly empty parking lot, I would gather the pieces of my shattered identity and forge a new beginning. I wouldn't let the ghosts of betrayal define me. Instead, I would find strength in the very pain that threatened to consume me. It was a promise to myself, a promise to move forward even if each step felt heavy with the weight of loss. In the days that followed, I began to take small steps toward reclaiming what little control I still had. I set new goals at work, embraced the daily rhythm of tasks that brought structure to an otherwise disordered life, and even allowed myself moments of reflection when the memories threatened to overwhelm me. The process was neither quick nor easy, and every day was a battle between resignation and the stubborn spark of hope. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with pain and uncertainty, but I also knew that remaining in the ruins of my former life was no longer an option. The image of the ladder, once an insignificant fixture, had transformed into a symbol of the night everything changed. It reminded me that even when the world collapses, there is still a way to climb out of the darkness, step by painful step. That evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of my workshop, the sound of my own steady breathing mingled with the distant hum of the city. I realized that though my heart was heavy with loss, it was also capable of healing. And perhaps, in time, the echoes of betrayal would give way to the gentle murmur of acceptance, a quiet understanding that sometimes even the most shattered lives can find a way to be whole again. In the weeks that followed my quiet vow to rebuild, life took on a tentative rhythm, one that was both unfamiliar and unyielding. Each morning, I awoke with the memory of that night still echoing in my mind. But now I faced the day with a fragile determination. I immersed myself in work at the shop, letting the clatter of tools and the steady hum of engines drown out the whispers of regret. Yet, even as I tightened bolts and adjusted wrenches, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled back into the wreckage of my former life. One crisp morning, as I sat in the dim light of my workshop, I found myself reflecting on the stark contrast between what once was and what now remained. The faces of Lila, Darren, and Jake haunted me, each a ghost of a memory that had once promised love, family, and stability. I remembered Lila's soft laughter when we first met, the comfortable silence we shared on quiet evenings, and the dreams we built together. Now, those recollections were splintered by betrayal, replaced by the harsh reality of empty rooms and unspoken resentments. I tried to push those thoughts aside as I worked on an old pickup truck that had seen better days. My hands moved with practiced precision, each motion a silent mantra against the chaos within. Yet, every now and then, I'd pause, the weight of loss pressing on my chest, and for a moment, I'd see flashes of that night on the ladder. Lila's startled eyes, the smirk on Jake's face, and Darren's cold indifference. Those images were like broken shards of glass that cut deeper with every recollection. One afternoon, As the rain began to fall in a steady drizzle outside, I decided that avoidance could only carry me so far. With a hesitant resolve, I drove back to the house, the place that had once been my sanctuary, now a testament to the unraveling of trust. I parked at a distance, the car engine ticking down in the cool air, and approached the front door slowly. The sight that greeted me was both painfully familiar and hauntingly alien. The house was silent. I could see faint silhouettes through the windows, shapes that moved with the monotony of routine, as if the betrayal had settled into the walls like a permanent stain. I stepped inside, each footfall echoing in the emptiness. The living room was stripped of any warmth. The couch, which had once been a place of shared laughter, now sat like a barren island amid a sea of silence. I wandered from room to room, each space a painful reminder of the life I'd lost, until I finally reached the kitchen, the heart of our once shared home. There, on the counter, lay remnants of a life that was no longer mine. A half-empty mug of cold coffee, a stray newspaper, and a single, folded note that I wasn't sure I was ready to read. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the paper soft and worn between my fingers. It was Lila's handwriting, a brief message that spoke of her decision to leave and the hope that someday, perhaps, we might find understanding. But the words felt like a distant echo, lost in the vast gulf of what had transpired. I couldn't bring myself to read further, so I folded the note back up and set it aside, unwilling to face the painful admission of goodbye. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent, as if mirroring my inner turmoil. I lingered for a moment in that desolate kitchen, feeling the cold touch of loneliness seep into my bones. Yet, in that stillness, I also recognized a stirring inside me, a spark of defiance that refused to let the past completely dictate my future. I knew that the path ahead would be filled with uncertainty and pain, but I also realized that I could no longer remain a passive observer in the ruins of my own life. Determined to reclaim at least a part of what I had lost, I made my way back to the truck and set off once again. The drive was long and solitary, the highway stretching out before me like a promise of escape. I turned on the radio, letting a soft, bluesy tune fill the silence. The melody was both melancholic and resolute, and as I drove, I began to feel that perhaps I was not entirely broken. Maybe, in time, I could piece together a new life from the shards of the old. Over the following days, I took small, deliberate steps toward change. I started by revisiting some of the old hobbies I had once loved, fishing on quiet mornings by the river, long walks along the empty stretches of the shoreline, and even reading a book or two that had gathered dust on my shelf. Each small act was an assertion of my right to find joy, even in the midst of heartache. I sought out moments of quiet reflection, where I could face my own thoughts without the constant distraction of work or the numbing effects of solitude. At the shop, I began to notice a change in the way I approached my tasks. The once monotonous rhythm of oil changes and engine repairs gradually transformed into a meditation, a form of therapy that allowed me to focus on something tangible. My hands, once stained with the residue of lost dreams, now carried the promise of renewal with each measured movement. I started to see my work not just as a means of escape, but as a way to rebuild something solid and lasting. Yet, there were still nights when the memories returned with a vengeance. In the quiet hours before dawn, I would lie awake, haunted by the echo of laughter that wasn't meant for me and the sight of a ladder that had once marked the turning point of my life. Those nights were the hardest, filled with an overwhelming sense of regret and longing for what might have been. But even in that darkness, I clung to the belief that there was a way forward, a path that, though uncertain, might eventually lead to healing. One evening, as I sat in the back of the truck under a sky filled with indifferent stars, I made a decision. I would confront the past, not to reopen old wounds, but to find closure. I reached out to an old friend, someone who had seen me through better times, and arranged to meet for coffee. In that conversation, I allowed myself to speak honestly about the betrayal, the loss, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. It wasn't an easy confession, and there were moments when the words faltered, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of relief. Sharing the burden made it a little lighter. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I began to understand that rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past, it was about accepting it and using it as a stepping stone towards something new. I learned to acknowledge the pain without letting it define me, and with each small victory, be it a successful repair job at the shop or a quiet morning spent watching the sunrise, I began to feel a little more whole. There were still many questions that remained unanswered. How would I ever face Lila again? Could I ever trust someone enough to open my heart again? And what of the family that had once been mine, now fractured beyond recognition? The answers were elusive, hidden beneath layers of hurt and disillusionment. But as I looked out at the dark road ahead, I knew that I was ready to face whatever came my way. I was no longer running blindly into the night. I was taking deliberate steps toward a future of my own making. The journey was far from over, and the path was steep and uncertain. But in that uncertainty lay the possibility of renewal, a chance to redefine myself, to forge a new identity from the remnants of the old. I resolved to keep moving forward, one careful, determined step at a time, knowing that even the longest nights eventually give way to the promise of dawn. In the quiet aftermath of that long, reflective period, I realized that every day now carried a dual promise, the bitter sting of memory and the faint glimmer of renewal. The house still loomed in my thoughts, its empty rooms and silent halls echoing with ghosts of what had been, but I was slowly learning that moving forward meant accepting that those walls no longer defined me. I returned to my routine at the shop with a new perspective. Each car I fixed and every engine I tuned became an exercise in reclaiming control. My hands, once trembling with the weight of betrayal, now worked with a measured determination. The greasy fingerprints on my skin served as a reminder that I was capable of rebuilding something solid. Every day, the familiar clang of metal and hum of machinery was a small victory over the chaos of my past. One afternoon, while working on an aging sedan, I caught sight of my own reflection in the polished fender. The eyes staring back looked tired and haunted, yet they held a spark, a flicker of resolve that hadn't been there before. It struck me then that change wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it into who I had become. The scars, both visible and hidden, were part of my story. And with that thought, I allowed myself to feel a cautious hope, however fragile. After closing the shop one brisk evening, I decided to take a walk through the old parts district. The narrow streets and flickering neon signs were familiar, yet everything felt subtly altered, like a photograph slightly faded over time. I found myself drawn to a small, weathered cafe that had managed to survive the years, much like I was determined to do. Its windows glowed warmly in the twilight, promising a brief respite from the relentless pace of life. Inside the cafe, I sat at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and allowed my mind to wander. The soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of porcelain provided a backdrop that was both comforting and reflective. I scribbled a few lines in an old notebook, a habit I'd once abandoned when life felt too heavy to put into words. The act of writing, even if it was just disjointed thoughts on paper, became a cathartic release. In those words, I tried to capture the emotions of betrayal, loss, and the tentative hope of a new beginning. Across town, the house that had once been our shared home began its own quiet transformation. Lila's departure had left a void, not just in the structure of the building but in the routines that had defined our lives. Darren and Jake, once unwitting players in a drama I could neither accept nor understand, seemed to drift into their own separate existences. The silence in those rooms was deafening to me, a constant reminder that the person I had known was gone, replaced by shadows of memories. Yet, in that silence, I also sensed an opportunity, a chance for the old to be replaced by something different, something that might one day heal. I began making small visits back to the house, not to rehash the past, but to retrieve fragments of a life that might still hold meaning. I dusted off an old photograph from the mantel, a picture of Lila and me on happier days, and I spent a long moment simply staring at it. It was painful, yet strangely comforting. It reminded me that there had been a time when love was simple and honest, even if it had been flawed. Those moments were now stepping stones rather than anchors, guiding me toward the person I was meant to become. In the weeks that followed, I started taking deliberate steps to rebuild my identity. I reached out to that old friend again, the one who had listened without judgment and helped me find words for my pain. We met regularly for coffee, and those conversations, though laced with sorrow, slowly began to fill in the gaps in my shattered confidence. With every shared memory and every quiet moment of understanding, I started piecing together a life that was no longer defined solely by betrayal. There were still days when the weight of the past pressed too heavily upon me. Nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by echoes of laughter and the cold, calculated images of that fateful night on the ladder. But gradually, those moments began to recede into the background, like distant thunder after a storm. I discovered that even in the midst of pain, there was room for small joys, a sunrise on a crisp morning, the satisfaction of a job well done, or even the simple pleasure of a shared smile with a stranger. One chilly evening, as I drove home along a winding country road, the sky was a tapestry of indigo and silver. The radio played an old blues record, its melancholic melody weaving through my thoughts. I couldn't help but think that, much like the song, my life was a composition of sorrow and hope, each note carrying its own weight. With every mile, the burden of my past felt just a bit lighter, replaced by the promise of something new. Back at the shop, a particularly challenging repair job on an old pickup truck tested my resolve one day. The work was grueling, and as I struggled with a stubborn bolt, frustration threatened to overwhelm me. But then, a fellow mechanic, noticing my furrowed brow, offered a word of encouragement, a simple acknowledgement that even the toughest tasks eventually yielded to persistence. In that moment, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just a solitary endeavor, it was a collective journey shared with others who had known their own battles and scars. Emboldened by these small affirmations, I began to consider the possibility of more than just surviving. I started attending local gatherings, a community workshop, a neighborhood meetup where I met others who had experienced their own losses. Their stories, filled with both tragedy and triumph, resonated with me. I learned that every life had its seasons of darkness and light, and that sometimes the only way to move forward was to embrace both. One crisp morning, as I sat at the edge of a quiet riverbank, a place that had once been a sanctuary of solitude, I allowed the cool water to wash over my feet. The river flowed steadily, undeterred by the obstacles in its path. It struck me as a perfect metaphor for my own journey, persistent, relentless, and ever-changing. I closed my eyes and listened to the gentle murmur of the current, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that maybe I was ready to let go of the past and embrace the uncertain future. The latter, the symbol of my awakening, still lingered in my mind, not as a harbinger of betrayal, but as a reminder that every ascent begins with a single, painful step. I acknowledged that the scars of that night would always be a part of me, yet they no longer defined the entirety of my existence. I was learning to accept that healing was not linear, it was a mosaic of setbacks and small victories, of tears shed in darkness and smiles that broke through the gloom. Now, as I set my gaze on the horizon, I felt a cautious excitement at the prospect of new beginnings. The journey was far from over, and I knew that there would be more nights filled with restless thoughts and days marked by quiet battles. But each step, each deliberate effort to rebuild was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In that moment of quiet reflection, by the river with the steady current and the cool breeze whispering promises of renewal, I made a silent vow to honor the past while forging a future that belonged to me, a future defined not by the ghosts of betrayal, but by the possibility of rediscovered hope. And with that resolve, I stepped away from the riverbank, leaving behind the ruins of a once familiar life and moving forward, one determined, unyielding step at a time. Standing at the threshold of what remained, I realized that every scar told a story of loss, of betrayal, but also of survival. In the quiet aftermath of shattered promises, I had learned that life is not defined by its darkest moments, but by the courage to rise again after each fall. The house, once a symbol of all that I had cherished, now lay empty, a relic of a past that had slipped irretrievably away. I walked through its silent corridors one last time, feeling the echoes of old laughter and the weight of unspoken apologies mingle with the dust of forgotten dreams. With each step, I acknowledged that I could neither erase the past nor pretend it had never hurt. Instead, I chose to carry its lessons forward. On the open road, beneath a sky streaked with the early hues of dawn, I felt a fragile hope emerging. The long, winding journey ahead would not be easy, every mile would demand a piece of my strength. Yet, with the steady hum of the engine and the gentle whisper of the wind as my companions, I resolved to build a future where pain was not a shackle but a stepping stone. I would reclaim my identity, one careful, deliberate decision at a time. In the days to come, I promised myself that I would seek moments of solace in unexpected places, the soft murmur of a river, the quiet company of a stranger who understood loss, and the reassuring rhythm of work that once again made my hands steady. The wounds would mend slowly like a tapestry woven from both sorrow and resilience. I knew that the road ahead was uncertain, that some nights I would still lie awake haunted by memories of betrayal. But as the new day broke over the horizon, its light carried a promise, the promise that every ending holds within it the seeds of a new beginning. And so, with a final, resolute breath, I stepped forward into the unknown, ready to embrace the dawn, however fragile it might be.